All right. Today's first word for attendance is door, like the thing you open and close. Today's going to be interesting. I got to kind of rush through things. We're going to finish up chapter 19 and then start chapter 20. Before we get started, do some announcements as usual. So the lab is going to be interesting this week. It might be hard for you to read. But this week's lab, obviously we're not going to meet unless you want to. I'll be online if you need me. And you don't even have to do a new lab. What I'm going to do this week is pick your lowest lab grade, and that's going to be your grade for this week. So it's not just that. You can leave it at that if you want. If you're fine with your lowest lab grade being counted twice, you can do that. Otherwise, just go back through, find out what your lowest lab grade is, and fix it if you want. Not only will you get to fix it for your, original lab grade, but obviously that'll fix your that'll help your grade for this week. Does anybody have any questions about that? That makes sense, right? You're going to go out there and find your lowest lab grade, and if you're fine with it, then you're done. But if you want to fix it, you can. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes. Question.
Yes.
So I know for a fact that I didn't do maybe one lab, like lab one. Say, for instance, I can just go back in, go to lab one, and fill out that lab.
Exactly. Great question. And that brings me to my next point, which is sadly, some of you have multiple zeros. So in your case, you actually need to, well, either way, when you're done, you need to let me know when you're done and which lab you redid. But if you have multiple zeros, it might, you might want to meet me. So, or just determine whichever one you want to do. It doesn't matter, but it's important to let me know which one you're going to do, because obviously if you have multiple zeros, you're going to need to let me know which one to count, because, hey, I'm redoing the Ecological Footprint lab, and I want that to count as my lowest grade. So that's how that's going to work. And again, I'll be online because I know some of you some of you haven't figured out how to use the online grade sheet. So I'll be there online for lab. Even though we don't have to meet online, I'll be there. That way, if you want to meet with me, and we can go through that grade sheet and we can talk about what your lowest lab grade is. And if you have questions on how to do that lowest lab, all that stuff. So I'll be there if you need me, but it's pretty simple. Just basically find your lowest lab grade, let me know which one you're redoing, and redo it. And that'll be due on Sunday. I know normally I give you a week, but next week's finals week. This is the last week of class, so it'll be due on Sunday. Any questions about that? All right. And obviously, if you do have questions between now and then, contact me or just show up online at noon, and I'll be there. Finals, I already talked about finals, so I'm not going to say much about it. Just repeat what I said earlier. It's online. It's Monday. If you don't want to do it online or you don't want to do it Monday, contact me. All right. Any questions? Let's jump into it. This should be pretty quick and easy. The very last part of chapter 19 is talking about ecological footprint, which you should already be very familiar with from the lab, because you already did that. And there was a lot of information in there, not just your ecological footprint, but footprints in general. Before I want to discuss how the book describes it, I want to remind you the most basic way to think about it. Your ecological footprint is basically the amount of space needed to provide for you, right? So all the timber needed to build your house, all the metal, all the land, where they mined the ore to make the metal to make your car, all the land it takes to, grow the food you need, all the land it takes to take care of all your trash, all that stuff. That's your ecological footprint, right? How much space do you need? That's basically it. Your book goes in a little bit more detail, and so did the lab, but that's basically the way you should think of it. Anyway, the U.S. Census Bureau projects, at least at the time that this was printed, your book was printed, that the global population of 8 billion, that will hit a global population of 8 billion within 10 years and 9.6 billion by 2050. We're actually pretty close to 8 billion right now. I think we're at 7.8 billion, I think. You don't need to know those numbers. The point is we have a large population. So again, when you think about the lab you did, try to imagine whatever your ecological footprint is. Imagine if everybody in the world had a footprint that large, it probably wouldn't be sustainable, which is what your book gets at with this next bullet point. Do we have sufficient resources to sustain 8 or 9 billion people? And as you know, technically, we don't have enough resources in a way to sustain what we have now. Because if you remember, what we looked at right now is we are using more resources than are being produced every year. So yes, we have a store of resources. It's a large earth, but every year we're dipping into our savings, so to speak, because we're using more than we produce. And that is not sustainable. That is an issue. So your book says that the world food production must increase to accommodate people living, expected to live in the upcoming decades, and not just to provide for them just so we can squeak by and survive, but also to improve the diets of currently malnourished. So basically what they're trying to say is we have an issue. There's a lot of humans use a lot of resources. So we need to figure something out because we're going to eventually run out of resources. Any questions about that? All right. Your book also gets into some more detail. I'm not going to ask you any of these questions, but agricultural lands are already under pressure. I already kind of hinted at that one on that last slide. But more specifically, how are they already under pressure? Well, if you eat meat, or not necessarily you, but depending on where your meat comes from, there's places where overgrazing has turned grassland into desert. I'm sure you guys have seen pastures where cows are out there walking around eating grass. Well, that would be a grassland, right? And in some places of the world, there's too many cows, not enough rain, and therefore those grasslands turn into desert, and usually that is not reversible. Another thing that your book points out is that the water usage is expected to increase up to 6 times in the next 70 years. So obviously that's going to be an issue, right? We're going to be using more water. As a matter of fact, I think I'll double check on this, but I think I've posted some independent work videos that you can watch that involve the water usage issues. Another issue that your book points out is that changes in precipitation cause food shortages in some regions. Again, we could go on and on about that into detail, but we don't have time to do that. Again, there should be some videos and independent work that you can watch about that. And if they're not posted there yet, I will post them there soon. And then finally, because so much open space is needed to support our expanding population, other species are expected to become extinct. Obviously, right? Other species need resources too. And as our human population grows and we expand and take up more space, then those other species are out of space and therefore out of resources. So pretty much common sense stuff here. Any questions about that slide? All right, the next slide is the most important one regarding the exam anyway, because it includes 2 words you need to know, 2 words that you should be already familiar with. The first one is ecological footprint. And according to your book, that is the estimated area of land and water required to provide resources that an individual or nation consumes, right? And that makes sense because you did the calculator and you figured out what your GHA was, right? And remember, GHA was like a different way of saying acres. I mean, it's different than acres, but basically when you think of acres, you think of like a size of land, or square miles, right? Size of land. GHA is the same kind of thing. And you figured that out. You figured out what your GHA was. And then if you did the rest of the lab, you also looked up the data and saw the GHA of the world and the GHA of different countries. So you should be very familiar with what an ecological footprint is. As I already mentioned earlier before we got started, this GHA, when we're talking about the resources, that includes food, fuel, and housing, right? So that's the resources you use directly. And then the other bullet point would be the resources or the stuff you produce, the waste you produce, right? So how much land do we need to absorb the waste, the carbon emissions, and major components of basically the resources you use. So any questions on what an ecological footprint is? All right. And then finally, again, the other word that you might need to know for the exam, the one that you should be familiar with from the lab. If we compare our demand for resources, which is basically the ecological footprint, with the Earth's capacity to renew resources, which is called the biocapacity, and that's what you need to know, Earth's capacity to renew resources, that gives us a broad view of the sustainability of human activities. So that's what I had you do, I think, in that last table on the exam, right? You did the math. You said, all right, this country's GHA was this. This is how much resources that country uses versus this country's biocapacity was this, which is how much resources that company produces, that country. And therefore you could learn, if it was a negative number, that means that country was using more than it was producing. And on the opposite end, if that number was positive, then you would know that the country was producing more than it was using. So pretty simple stuff here. Any questions about this slide? All right. According to the World Wildlife Fund, the average ecological footprint for the world population at the time of this book being printed was about 1.5 planets. Meaning, if you were to look at every single human and average up the amount of resources they use, that means if we were to have an Earth that could produce that much sustainably, we would need 1.5 Earths, which is impossible, right? Especially considering as the human population grows, technically Earth is going to be able to produce less. So we're not in a good position. As basically when I say we're not in a good position, that's what your book points out here. Overshooting our biocapacity means that we are depleting our resources. Again, you should think of it as a bank account, because you might think to yourself, again, how is it possible that we're using more than's been produced? Well, keep in mind that for billions of years, Earth has been around without humans producing resources. So we do have a savings account, so to speak, but now we're not adding to the savings account. Now we're dipping into the savings account every year because we're spending more than we're making. Speaking of which, this next slide I'm going to show you shows a visualization of everything we're talking about. We're going to compare the ecological footprints of several countries to the world average and, of course, Earth's biocapacity. There's nothing to memorize here. If anything, I might give you this graph and ask you a question about it. So, you need to have that third grade skill of being able to look at a graph and interpret data. So I might say something like, what is China's ecological footprint? And you look here and like, okay, there's China. And that bar goes to right about here. And if I look over here on the y-axis, that's right above 2. So then you would choose an answer that was right above 2 on the multiple choice exam. That's how it would work on the exam. But the take-home message for this, as far as the discussion is concerned, you can see here, again, the world average for the global hectares per person, so the amount of area needed per person, it's right here, right below 3. That's how much land the average human needs. And unfortunately, Earth's biocapacity is way down here. It is below 2. Again, meaning that we are using every year more resources than we are producing. And you might not think that's a problem now, but again, that means we're dipping into our savings account, so to speak, and eventually we are going to run out. So it is an issue that needs to be addressed and something to keep in mind. Any questions about that graph? All right. And also, if you look at this graph, you can see that some countries, like, look, the United States on this graph has the highest bar, right? We are using the most resources compared to anyone else on this graph. Meanwhile, I've got countries like Afghanistan and Haiti who are below Earth's biocapacity, right? They are very low. So your book points out that affluent nations consume disproportionate amounts of resources. And you should already know this from the lab too. There's 2 questions where they said, do you think your footprint is larger or smaller or the same as the world average? And then the next one was, do you think your footprint is larger, smaller, or the same as the US average? And what you should have known before that from that little video you watched is that the United States has a very large GHA, right? We use a disproportionate amount. So, and your book points this out, this is an important problem. People do talk about the fact that we as a planet do have a population problem, in a sense, in a way, but it's not just overpopulation, right? So our population problem is not just the number of humans, it is also overconsumption, right? So it's not simply the number of humans on Earth, but also the amount of resources that certain humans are using, including myself and you. Specifically, and you do not have to know this for the exam, but your book gets specific and puts numbers to it. The richest countries on Earth, which make up 15% of the global population, so a very small minority of the global population, account for 36% of the total footprint, right? So even though we're talking about a very small portion of the population, we actually account for a very large portion of the footprint because we use so many resources. Basically, what we're saying here is if everybody lived like us, then we would need about 4 Earths to sustain life on Earth. So it's just something to consider, right? We need to figure out ways to use our resources more efficiently. Is probably the big take-home message there. Any questions about this? Here's a picture from your book as an example. At the top, this is a typical, I don't want to say living or dining room because it's not technically a dining room probably. It's probably just where they're happening to be eating at the moment. But that's a family in Afghanistan sitting down for a meal. And then down here, I think, was a family in the United States sitting down for a meal. And it's just meant to illustrate some of the differences. So any questions about that?
That's so sad.
Yeah, so bad. He points out it's so sad. And you know what? It's funny. You should mention that too, because I doubt to the Afghanis it's that sad. You know what I mean? And like likewise, there's probably plenty of Americans who would see this and be like, "Oh my God, that's so sad. Where's the Dom Perignon? What are they serving themselves? They don't have waiters. And look how tiny that kitchen is, right?" So it's all relative. I mean, yeah, that seems sad, but you know, I bet they're happy. Something else to consider, right? Maybe we could be happier with fewer resources ourselves. I know I could. I tried my best to downsize. But anyway, that's it for chapter 20. Are there any questions about chapter 20? I mean chapter 19. Yeah. All right. So the second word for attendance then on that note will be mistake, since I just made one. And let me open up chapter 20, the last chapter of the semester. Let's see if we can get through it. What I do love about this chapter, well, I love a lot of things about this chapter, but one of the good things that you might love about it is pretty simple. This is common sense stuff. When we start talking about ecology and ecosystems, basically I'm going to be giving